Welcome to our first ever medical evaluation laboratory fireside chat and/or dockside chat. Just wait till it gets warmer. I think those of you in Minnesota know that snowflakes were flying yesterday, so we're still in the the water is no longer frozen. It still sometimes feels that it can precipitate and get frozen and fall down. I think most people know my name is Steve Parenti. I'm Associate Dean for the Carlson Global Institute and former Medical Industry Leadership Institute Director and one of the founders of the lab. My compatriot here is Tom Gunderson. Tom, you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Steve. I think, like you said, this is a crowd that knows us well, but I am a former Wall Street analyst in the med tech area for Piper Jaffray, now Piper Sandler. I've been retired for 5 years, and as part of my retirement, I've started working more with the University of Minnesota, in particular Carlson School of Management, and in particular Millie and the Value Lab. And it's been very interesting to be able to have the time to roll up my sleeves and get more involved in these types of endeavors that you all have been doing for well over a decade. I did have to say, and that when you and Mike and Jessica asked me to teach a class, it took me a while to figure out what I could teach. It ends up that it's more, from a valuation standpoint, it's more about IPOs and venture capital than it is any of the financial things that there are people who are better at it than I. But with that, just as a personal note, I'll kick it back over to you, Steve, and let's see where we go with this.
Thanks so much, Tom. So our format here is going to be pretty casual in terms of how we're going to go forward. We're open for suggestions as we go. We are recording this, so just a little bit of the sense of how we're going to do this. There's a Q&A function that I think most of you know Jessica Haupt, our managing director, is watching for us. And so we're going to take a few pauses every once in a while and see what questions might pop in there. Everyone knows Jessica might sneak a question in that we don't expect either. So that's a great way to keep in touch with us. And then also, just so you know, our format that we're experimenting with here, it's first time, is we're going to have an hour of this conversation, very conversational. We're going to do this, the hope is every month, and pick another speaker. Sometimes Tom might talk to someone, sometimes I'll talk to someone. There might even be somebody who's a guest seminar that could come along the way too. But then after an hour, we're going to have an off-the-record conversation, meaning we're going to stop the recording. Those of you that want to stay on, that's fine. One thing we're going to experiment of whether or not we want to, depending on who attends, whether we want to go to a Zoom conversation, but we figure for those that want to network and things like that, that might be a nice way to kind of engage going forward. So those are our ground rules. And I have to do one last thing, since this is recording and we'll see who's here. I have to make a public service announcement. So one of the most exciting things that we're doing recently is we're starting a brand new medical industry MBA program inspired by the folks that did the Valuation Lab. I think now 800 strong of you since 2008. And I'll just share my screen briefly and sell this program for all of 2 minutes or 30 seconds. So we now have set up a global medical industry MBA program. This is the website. You can Google it and find it. And we're accepting applications for fall of 2021. It's all asynchronous, and it's intended to be, because it's global, to have people from around the globe. So in the parlance of Step Brothers, we're going worldwide, wide. But here's the caveat. It's only for overseas students. So no US domestic students, basically everybody but the United States of America. So we won't even include Canada as overseas. The other thing just to keep in mind for those of you networking for this is that we actually have a different price for this because it's overseas, just like the executive MBA programs we have in Vienna and in China, and also two of them in China. And those programs go for $60,000, which is still a lot, but it's a lot less and much more competitive in terms of pricing. So, and you're done in 2 years. And the feature point of the whole thing is that you do the valuation lab in different locations around the globe. And we're hoping to expand them besides just Shanghai, Stockholm, and Minnesota and Palo Alto to potentially include Israel and Australia going forward. So that is the end of the public service announcement. I hope I kept to 2 minutes. And with that, Tom, I know we've been thinking about this conversation for a while. I'm going to throw it back to you to kind of we're just going to throw 2 questions at each other about where we think the world is, because we titled this "The Eye of the Storm."
The eye of the storm.
Might simply be, why is it the eye of the storm?
So before we get to that, I'm curious about the global MBA, MIMBA, GMIMBA. You said a couple of things, and I appreciate that it was to be succinct, but what are the major differences for someone who overseas that would be looking at doing this, either as you just described it, or coming and getting the MBA with a medical industry focus?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's almost like we planned this, Tom. The interesting thing is we did, which is great. So I'm actually going to point back to the website then. So under academics, there's a quote from me, which can be, actually it's a quote from Mike Rand Park, who's someone to talk ethics from. If you look at the curriculum, that's probably going to show you where it's different. We know we have a lot of folks here that are coming in that potentially did the specialization with Millie from before. So basically it's a 2-year program. So some of these courses should be very familiar if you've done an MBA before, like financial accounting and an HR course in strategic management, ethics and such. But we also have, unlike the specialization, really a huge deep dive into healthcare. So we have, instead of a regular healthcare marketplace, a global healthcare marketplace course. We start off also in the first year talking about health law and intellectual property, because that is, those of you who've gone through the lab know, it's a major issue. So Ralph Hall is actually teaching that. I'll be teaching marketplace. The second academic year, we get into ethics with Rand Park, who's just an outstanding scholar in that space. But if you notice, we have a lot of courses that are very specific to the healthcare space, whether it's IT, pharmaceutical, med device, really kind of the signature courses that have been just taught by professionals in the medical industry. And we've already pioneered this now for 2 cohorts, working with partners in Shanghai. So the content's already there. And then it closes with the capstone experience of the valuation lab. And people can do the valuation lab in 2 different locations around the globe. We even have a virtual version if traveling is a limitation for you. We don't want it to be, but ideally, I think as most people know, and Tom, you were there in Palo Alto for 2 weeks, you know, it's like, it's really intense to do that in person, and a really strong experience. And then there's also a whole set of questions and Q&A here that makes it different. But I think the sense of it is cohorted. It's global, even though you're networking with people across the globe, but the hope is you will all come together at least once or twice. And even with some regular MBA students for the lab, wherever we travel around the globe. So it's really taking the best of what we've done with our medical industry curriculum and really taking it to a much bigger global audience, because we still think we have a pretty unique niche in this space. And near as I can tell, both with the lab and some of the things that we're doing here, I really haven't seen a program quite like this to this scale.
Got it. Thanks. So if ball is back to me, that means I'm going to ask you some questions here. I'm just going to take the assumption from the audience that between Steve and I, one of us, me, in the last 4 to 5 years, has just been in retirement preparing to be quarantined during a worldwide pandemic. So what I've done wouldn't fill up an hour very much. On the other hand, the other one on this call spent time in the White House. So we're what, 100 days, not even 100 days in to a new administration. And yet you were in Washington for much longer than that. What's on the current events? I guess I'd like to hear a little bit about the vaccine, how we got to the point where we could get a vaccine like this. I have a cell biology background way back when there were, what, like 4 elements, earth and wind and fire, those kinds of things. But even then, I can look at what we've done with this mRNA vaccine and say, my goodness, this is really good science, and we got maybe see what you have to say about this, but maybe we just got really, really lucky that it works as well as it does right when we need it. But what did the White House, what does the federal government do differently with the vaccine from your point of view?
I mean, I mean, what do you think they should be doing now, or how did we get?
No, where did, Operation Warp Speed, and what did the government do from, not from what the media tell us or from what one side or the other side of the aisle tells us, but from a guy that was inside? How did you view the different approach that we took to doing that?
I think one of the biggest differences was that we knew that the only way we were going to get out of this was almost the same way we got out of almost every other major crisis for the last, I'd say 150 years, which is, the private sector in concert will move things forward. So, I mean, I would say probably, most people sort of thought of, at least myself, when we got into the COVID situation, we were in a war economy. Everything had changed with the shutdowns, but even prior to that, there was the recognition that somehow if we were to get to a vaccine, we had to get there very quickly. And I think the one thing that was helpful if there was ever a time for this to hit an administration, it's probably the first year of an administration, particularly the Trump administration, that really were, some people had been in government before, some people had not. Probably not the best time, but getting into their third or fourth year when they kind of know each other, and people that are sticking around know how to interact with folks, made a big difference. I mean, myself included, I wasn't supposed to stick around past April of last year, but then pretty much there was a lot of trusted relationships to kind of execute things. I think the biggest thing was the mRNA innovation. There was money from a group called BARDA that operates within NIH. Think of it as a DARPA for essentially infectious diseases. And the other thing is that China was cooperating eventually to the point where they gave us essentially the whole footprint, genetic footprint of essentially what the disease was. And because of that, it allowed a variety of companies fairly quickly on to get that data, say, you know what, there's a variety of different ways we can do this. Matter of fact, not just one, but 2 or 3 or 4, maybe 6. And basically inviting them to come to the table and say, give us your best ideas. The key thing that was distinct, though, was to say, even if we don't know whether these things are going to be working, we're going to invest in production. So for those who know drugs, basically we knew after doing a phase 1 assessment of about 6 or 7 of these things very quickly that the likelihood of success was high. And so it would be worth the money to ramp up production, even knowing that there was technically a phase 2 and a phase 3 that had to occur. And so that was probably the biggest distinction of figuring out how this would go. The second thing that was a real big innovation too was the sense of saying, if we're going to worry about distribution and getting distribution out at a totally global scale in a way that we've never really done ever, because we had some innovations with the Ebola vaccine that was being developed that said that mRNA would work. The other thing that was interesting was to say, like, what parts of the government do distribution well? And so basically the sense was, well, the military does. And so actually enlisting the military as a support strategy, working with the Emergency Preparedness Center that's inside of HHS and coordinating literally across agency function in terms of distribution, production, working with the private sector. For example, if you remember in the beginning, FedEx and UPS basically tagging them both to do the initial distribution of Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. I mean, a lot of that was groundwork that was laid out throughout the summer, assuming the vaccines would come online with active tracking. So think of it, I always like a World War II analogy. Like, we knew that there were these moments where we could basically convince American industry to start making engines and propellers and tires and Jeeps and things like that. We had that as a construct. The question was, how fast do we accelerate it, given that we don't have to make a Jeep, we just have to make a vial and a pretty fast production process, and then use as much existing infrastructure as we can to distribute.
So then let's take what happened and look towards the future. I was reading a little bit about this today, and I didn't know this, but a lot was made about the mRNA and particularly the Pfizer one, and how cold it had to be kept, and special freezers, et cetera. But now we've done that, And I think Pfizer figured out it doesn't need to be quite that cold and got the FDA to ease up a little there, Moderna and others. But we've established, like you say, getting it out to the folks. We've established a cold chain, I think it's called, where other things in the future, whether they're genetic therapies or cell therapies, have to be kept cool. And so between the companies, maybe the military, maybe the ordinary distribution, and maybe the UPS and FedEx of the world, we seem to have gotten this network established. Was any of that talked about, and how we could use this going forward from a White House perspective?
Well, certainly in terms of planning, I mean, in terms of figuring that we knew there'd be another pandemic and there would be a thought of what we would have to mobilize to get it to go. I mean, I think I've said this in a few other comments before, but just interestingly, like my role in the White House was in the Council of Economic Advisors, but the odd thing was that I was also a senior advisor in the Department of Health and Human Services and worked with Alex Azar and had a lot of connections, and particularly because of the nomination process, had even more from before. So CEA put out a report in the fall of 2019 that actually started about 6 months before that, more or less, even before COVID was on anyone's mind or showed up, basically saying, like, if we have a global pandemic, it's going to potentially be a major problem when we have to mobilize, and we have to basically prioritize to take care of the health emergency, or else our economic damage is going to be massive. And so there is actually, people can find that report that's out there in the public domain. I mean, it was actually kind of oddly, spookily predicting like things that you have to worry about in the future in case something like this happens, and what you want to do if the distribution changed. Now, did we follow everything that was in that report? No. Was there a lot of innovation that had to occur across in a different way? Absolutely. But to your point that you mentioned earlier, like, did we get lucky? In a lot of ways, we did. We got lucky in the sense that the mRNA technologies worked. We got lucky in the sense that the Department of Health and Human Services and some of the other groups, they knew each other. There was a lot of active conversations between the White House and the FDA about accelerating a lot of things, regardless of COVID, just to like get biosimilars out. In other words, the FDA was used to the White House kind of like going like, now, to the point where once there was an emergency, particularly the leadership of the FDA, like Janet Woodcock and others, were just kind of like, yeah, we get it this time. You know, it's like the other stuff, the biosimilars, like, we're careful. We get that this is something that we have to ramp and go. And so that actually, if nothing else, provides a template to think about if someone's going to cry wolf again, that everyone knows like that we've reached DEFCON 1 and we have to go, as opposed to sort of the normal course of business.
You talked about cooperation from the private side, and particularly with vaccines, as you remember, most of the big drug companies got out of vaccines because there were so many lawsuits that were associated with it. Now, the partnership seems to have resolved the emergency, and then the partnership seems to have resolved some of that for now. Do you get a sense that that industry, we might have set a new level here where industry and government can work together beyond crisis management?
I hope so. I mean, and that was kind of the point in parts of the report we were writing in 2019, which is like, it's very undercapitalized in the vaccine world. We have to move very quickly if we got there. I mean, the one value is that, so one thing that's interesting about, that's unknown, and I didn't know until I was in the White House, is that when you had a report like that, that's like 40 pages long, you can't, it's not like an academic working paper where I could just drop something on the internet, where the council, which is only about 40 people, drop something on the White House blog and say like, hey, enjoy this. There's this process known as staff sec, or staff secretary. And so what that means is that anytime you want to put something out from the White House, not just Trump White House, any White House, it has to go through every single department that it might touch in terms of the implications of what would go on. So that was sort of the fascinating thing about putting a report like that out, because we mentioned civilian controls, we mentioned basically National Guard, we mentioned VA's distribution, we mentioned Department of Defense for this and other pieces, and obviously HHS and FDA as well. Every single one of those agencies had to sign off on that report. that happened 4 or 5 months prior to when COVID really hit. So it brought some awareness as to saying, if something happens, drop all your pencils, open your checkbook, we have to go. So, and I think the hope is that in terms of partnership with industry, if nothing else, the fact that the government responded as quickly as it did. I mean, there was things I got involved with that we moved very quickly with, where we had to make some really hard decisions fast. And one biggest one was recapitalizing the hospital industry. Like, what's the fastest way that's the most transparent and fairest way to get this done? Is it going to cover everything? Probably not, but at least it gets us to where we want to be. I mean, even when we focused on Pfizer and Moderna to get out the door, one of the biggest concerns was like, well, it's 2 shots. And what about people who don't come back? And it's all so cold, and it's not going to be going ramped up enough. I mean, we need to have the Johnson & Johnson thing now, because that's going to be like right at CVS and there. And we didn't anticipate that there would be, you know, the efficacy difference between the two is something that people are pausing about J&J, let alone the J&J pause that just occurred. You couldn't anticipate that. If anything, you would have thought, like, you know, it's quick, it's fast, we'll move quickly. Not that suddenly if you will, the boutique vaccine that we never thought could scale to production, suddenly when it's like, well, I guess we have to scale to production because we're waiting on J&J and AstraZeneca. Can you now take your patents, take your processes, and push it into other production facilities, so that instead of having 50 million, we're going to have 500 million quickly? And so that shows that government and industry can talk, regardless of the administration.
Got it. I'll get off this science thing here with one last comment, not a question. And that is Walter Isaacson. Many of you know this, but I'll just tell you, I read it and I like the book. Walter Isaacson, his latest book is called The Code Breaker. And it gets in a little bit into some of what we've been talking about as far as developing the vaccines. It goes on mostly about the CRISPR technology, but it's a good story, well told, and I think it will play into some of the things Steve and I were just talking about as we go into the future. So, Steve, question for me?
Yeah, I guess the big question I have for you, Tom, is this is sort of more of a whimsy question, but more of a serious question. I mean, as I've gotten to know you over the years, what always impresses me is that you will dive headlong into learning about a certain process by just asking the expert. So I remember you were telling me, like, you want to know more about cardiology. So you just decided, I'm going to go to the American College of Cardiology conference. Just talk to them, see what they're doing. And so my question is, post-COVID to you, what's the first conference you're going to barnstorm?
Oh, it's not where I thought you were going with that. Yeah, one of the things I do go to experts, and I'm hoping that's not a big surprise or out of the ordinary for the people that are watching this. I heard a story long ago about the engineering professor that taught the graduate engineering course, and at the end, the final was a single essay question for an engineering final of all things, and it was, how long does it take to bake a turkey? And quickly, the 3 answers that were highlighted in this vignette were 1, the engineering student who just worked it all out with the maths and the volumes and the heat transfer and the liquid temperatures, etc., and came up with the mathematical engineering kind of answer. The second student took a turkey and baked it and timed it and then ate the turkey while he wrote the answer. And the third one called his mom and got the answer. And that's kind of been my, and the question of the vignette was who would you hire? And everybody I tell that story says, well, God, you gotta go with the guy that called the expert, right? So that's why I talk to experts. I do like getting into those kinds of things. And so not to be too redundant here, but I might go to something, if it's different, that does have to do with this CRISPR technology. It feels today like it did to me back in the 80s when we were just getting started on the genetic manipulation that came up with companies like Amgen and Biogen, et cetera. This has that feel to me, but maybe with a little bit more tech override, so that what surprised me was, in reading this book, was that many of the geniuses that developed this were software engineers. They were coders. They see these problems, whether it's aughts and ones or ATCG, they just see it as a code and they can rewire it. Having that crossover between the medical biological people and the tech people in the world we live in, I think I might go to one of those conferences and see what's up, because I think it's a big deal going forward. I will also say that the other that I had to cut off because of, mostly because of retirement, was I started right at the end of my career going to the Consumer Electronics Show. And the Consumer Electronics Show had a huge hall of exhibitors that were just healthcare. And they had...
This is the one that's in Vegas, right?
Biggest industry conference in the world. I mean, every hotel's filled. The conference center is full, and they had a healthcare part. They had everything part, but they had a healthcare part that grew every year, that have lots of talks. But the one thing I was, one of those things you look for when you're going to something new, is who was the biggest exhibitor 7 years ago when I first went? Who was the biggest exhibitor in the Consumer Electronics Show for healthcare?
Apple? Who?
Yeah, that's what I would have guessed. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a United.
Yeah.
It was United Healthcare.
Really? Wow.
And it wasn't because they had so much tech, is that they, like me, but they on a bigger scale, wanted to know what was going on, what's hot, what's trending.
I mean, well, they build themselves as a technology firm, so it makes sense for them to be there, I suppose. So I'll fire another question toward you. So I recently was co-teaching a class, a pharmaceutical class for both our medical industry students in Shanghai, but also US students. And we had some guest speakers talking about some of these new revolutionary gene therapies that are out there that are, the most precise precision medicine you're going to get. But I mean, what struck me was that the price points for these things, I'm sure you've heard about this too, so I'm curious your thoughts. I mean, we're talking about multi-million-dollar therapies that are cures. And I guess, I mean, how does that work? I mean, I can tell you my thoughts of a health economist. I'm just thinking, like, is that, it seems as though the market is drifting this way. Do they really, is it the type of thing where we have to go to this sort of Elysium movie thing where it's like, it's going to be only the super rich get to see this thing? Or is there a pathway that makes sense to you?
You have to, my first reaction is the devices, which I know better, but I'll get into the drug side as well. The devices don't start out perfect and they don't start out cheap, but you need to start somewhere. And the system that we have of innovation and iterations was both for devices and for pharmaceuticals. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to be safe. And it has to have a relative amount of efficacy. I talked to a tech person who happened to be on the healthcare side at Apple and said, how are we going to resolve the differences between the way tech people think and the way healthcare people think? And he said, healthcare people need to spend years getting the product just right through the FDA, and here it is, and the next iteration comes out 3, 4, 5 years later. Said, we try to just get it out on the tech side, and version 2.0 will fix anything we didn't see, and 3.0 will fix that, and by then we're on to the next technology. And I said, so how do we resolve that? Who wins that debate? He goes, you need a third group of people that don't think, haven't been trained one way for their whole careers or the other way for their whole careers, but come up with some way to match it. On the pharma side, the example that I think of first off was Hep C. And that was expensive for its day, right? We have more expensive drugs now, but that was expensive for its day. But because it was a cure, the cost benefit for somebody who's 40 and doesn't have all these problems down the line, and you just cross off that medical cost going forward from being infected with hepatitis C virus, that worked, and then prices and competition begin to come down. So if you're doing these gene therapies, if you're doing some of these new pharma kinds of things, it will get down to how strong the patents are probably, right? And then I'll let you talk about the economics. I just have economics 101, but you could sell one dose for $1 billion, but then what do you do in year 2? And there's probably a price demand curve even for an expensive drug like that.
Yeah, I mean, and there could even be a price demand curve for more than 2 people. I mean, so part of it, I think, is, and this isn't economics as much as it's health economics, which is just a odd world. But in terms of looking at how a lot of other countries then approach reimbursement, right? So they look to see what the quality adjusted life year saves for the dollars that are put in. I know, like in the US, we're not allowed to talk about cost effectiveness, but we still do quietly. But the thought is, like, if it is like Hep C, to your point, if it's a cure, and you're talking about potentially something that's, let's say we're focused on pediatric things. Let's make it simple, right? And it's a cure, and there aren't other complications that you expect. You could make a legitimate case in terms of like overall life expectancy and things like that. That even at like a $2 million price point, it might work. And the hope is that if that does happen, you're right. Then hopefully there's more people to get into that space. The prices start to come down. They still might be high, but there could be a situation where those dollars sort of work in that mechanism that's there. I mean, the thing that I worry about, I guess, a little bit is how will insurers or how other people will look at that? Because I mean, that was actually the big thing with Hep C, that it was so expensive at first, the insurers didn't know quite what to do with it. And interestingly enough, when I've talked to some of my friends overseas in the UK, when they thought about covering the Hep C treatment, their attitude was like, this is a no-brainer. To your point, Tom, they're cured at 40. We're going to cover it. It actually fits the league table that the UK develops for the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. So you insurers, you go figure your stuff out. But for us, we already figured it out. And there's an open question about, if it gets more expensive, do you have to like make this a separate market? Do you almost have to make it like a high risk national thing that sort of takes it off the regular insurance pool, so that the regular insurance pool operates if these things start to grow? As near as I can tell, a lot of people are putting a lot of money into this. This is what makes the CRISPR stuff make money for people. So.
Right, and you give the example, and I'm sure students will learn this in the GMI MBA, but the social medicine in other countries are looking at larger populations on how they can cost justify some of these things, and they can control more of that, in my opinion, as opposed to where we've got Medicare and Medicaid and then the big 9 after that. And who's going to pay for it, who's not, who wants to do it as a loss leader, who wants to gain market share, who, et cetera, et cetera. It's not those same kind of national decisions that you see in some other countries. I'll give you one other as the healthcare economist to noodle on.
Yeah.
We're talking about the 40-year-old and what the cost benefit is, or the pediatric and what the cost benefit is. The CRISPR people are talking about correcting genetic diseases such that not only will we cure your sickle cell disease and have a cost benefit that way, you'll no longer be a carrier and you won't pass it on to future generations. And so think of the cost benefit that somebody has to go through on a national level. There's no way a private insurance is going to do it, but on a national level of what's the cost benefit over the next 3 generations of not having this disease.
Right. No, I mean, and again, you're right. From the social insurance perspectives, they're going to be fine with that. I do think there might, I mean, if nothing else, going back to our first conversation about COVID and the partnership between government and industry, you know, this is where that conversation potentially has to happen again soon. Because I mean, I think we don't want to be too permissive in the way we sort of develop our technology, but at the same time, we don't want to be so restricted in the way that we can't actually advance some of these things either. So we're about a half hour, a little bit more in, and I want to make a reminder to all the folks that are participating that we have a Q&A section here, or that Jessica is monitoring and can shout out a question to us or something to that effect. So our floor is open for any of your questions as well. And Tom and I have a raft of them to each other. And so besides just voting questions and whiskey choices, but we'll get down to that if it really needs to be that specific. But there we are.
No questions so far.
Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate that. Free beer to the first 3 people who ask questions. Steve, I'll toss it back to you. We were talking a little bit before the program started about, we wanted to talk about current events, and supply chain is something I brought up with a company a couple of weeks ago, and they said, oh, we solved all that. Sure, with China and the slowdown in the airlines and everything, but we've fixed that now. Not 2 days later, I talked to another company who was having supply chain problems and actually having to pull some products back and not sell them because of the Texas winter storm that affected the petrochemical businesses down there, and resins were affected, the raw materials being petrochemical, but being affected. Polypropylene is in lower supply, PVC prices have more than doubled. Now I'm going to go to the economist and the health economist. From somebody who's looked at it from the federal side and from the economic side, how do you view the interconnections that we have between, you know, a company in Northeast Minneapolis and, you know, middle of nowhere Texas, or a company in New Jersey and their supplier in China? All of that seems to have been questioned. I'll tell you, from a Wall Street standpoint, investors are looking at this and they're getting a little wary, worrying about, especially at these valuations, they're worried about the next issue that might get in the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as you know, I mean, we've become a much more interconnected, just-in-time supply chain response. I mean, I think that actually highlighted at the beginning of COVID what happens, right, when everything sort of stops and you're kind of stuck with your stock and you can't just readjust with just-in-time. You know, we all joked about getting our toilet paper and things like that are there. It's a real challenge though, because it's sort of, you know, you can sort of identify like what are essential elements in the economy, but like to your point about the resins in Texas, I mean, that probably top of mind might not have been something that someone was sort of thinking about. I mean, what I do know, I know when I worked in the Council of Economic Advisors, like if there was ever a storm that came through the Texas basin or came through the Gulf of Mexico, I mean, we always were actively tracking that because we knew that there could be a situation in terms of a shutdown of petroleum and gas supplies and everything else that would go into that, depending upon how serious that would be. You know, in terms of what that, sometimes there's at least as much of a quarter, half GDP bump from that. So, I mean, people would see that in a basic way, but I think it's in terms of protecting that as like, you know, here's a bunch of things that we need to make sure that we always have. It's a challenge. I mean, with COVID, I think the thought is that we now know that there are certain things with a pandemic we probably want to have better access to that we don't have to wait so quickly for. Though it's the thing that struggles though, and I pause a little bit with this, and I'm still processing it in a way, trying to think about it. If you think of like the deaths that occurred with COVID, it's not clear to me that the big surge in particularly the US deaths happened because we were having a supply chain problem. It happened because we were having a behavior problem, in my mind, that basically, also it's just nature. The thing got infectious and it got to winter and people wanted to, there's a question about what they could do or not. But I do think that, some attention to vital elements in the supply chain will matter. I mean, we saw semiconductors was a major issue recently too for auto manufacturer in terms of what actually goes on to the economy there. I mean, the semiconductor industry has a giant downstream impact in terms of what some of these things go on as well. I remember in the administration, and I know the Biden folks are concerned too about raw materials for pharmaceutical agents in terms of where they're coming from in the supply chain and what gets choked off there as well. But I will say that one thing that's interesting, I guess, putting on, again, my Carlson School hat, is that we have a Masters of Supply Chain program. KK Sinha ones and our faculty are there. I don't know whether it was COVID that did it or not, but I mean, of all of our master's programs after COVID hit, it suddenly doubled its size. So to the extent that if you think about it from this perspective, I guess, Tom, from a Wall Street perspective, if you're to mitigate your risk, you better get some experts to know how to manage that and see where you're going. Interestingly, a lot of those folks are ex-military too, so that part of what they know is essentially how to manage a supply chain because they have to. That's just in terms of how they operate their own systems.
So if we have any people in manufacturing on the line, correct me if I get this wrong, but a lot of time, I mean, you have to have all the parts, otherwise you don't have a $40,000 defibrillator at the end for want of a single screw kind of thing. And so you make sure you have the inventories of all of those to take care of normal kinds of issues. And you also look to often have second suppliers. What I was reading today about where we are in the world that we have currently was the thought of maybe, you mentioned it, made me think of this, is the raw materials for a majority of our pharmaceuticals come from China. And do we want to put all our, I'll use the cliche, eggs in one basket? And what they're starting to play around with is what they're calling China plus one. So we'll still work with China, but we want a local, whether the local is US or the local is France or Belgium, etc. We want a local that can give us at least some relief if there's a breakdown in the main chain. And then, and this is where I want to hear more from the Gamimba professor, is the Chinese are already looking at being the plus one and having a US outpost, if you will, for manufacturing 10% of what they're trying to get to whatever customer it is, and having 90% remain in China.
I mean, strategically, it's actually, I think of it in a slightly different way, maybe. And mainly it's because I'm looking at some things in the pharmaceutical industry that China is doing too. But I mean, the M&A, well, there's a question about what China does and what China wants to do and grow in terms of their 5-year plans and things like that. And so there's a question of how much can M&A do and how will M&A work and how can you justify M&A? And so one of the issues that could come into play is that 10% plus that you're talking about basically could be seen as a hedge for that too, in terms of having that that reserve component of what's there. That said, there's also a lot of other extra value features of having that as well. I mean, it's essentially that 10% plus probably comes from acquisition more likely than anything else, right? And so it allows essentially a way to sort of sell also in the years where you don't have a problem, where you don't have a supply constraint, to kind of grow a market in a different space as well. But it's a fascinating. There's just a lot of things that have come off the table that are here. So I'm going to throw a question back at you that's sort of near and dear to my heart, and just sort of see whether or not how it resonates with you, because I think I'm too deep in the weeds.
Okay.
And so, So one of the things I was working on in the administration was, and I have mixed feelings about it right now, but because we're halfway through the storm, as it were, is price transparency. The notion of if you give consumers prices on healthcare, it'll lower healthcare costs. So one of the big initiatives that I can tell you honestly that the President Trump himself actually really resonated with him. It wasn't like we put stuff in the teleprompter and I said, here's what you have to say. It's like, I totally get it. We need to be able to shop, and it can really make a difference. It'd be bigger than healthcare. He said it several times over. It was even kind of humorous because toward the end of the election cycle, even in rallies, these big rallies that the president would have, he would actually, there would be like one of the talking points was price transparency. And you could just hear crickets in the audience there. So my question to you, Tom, is were the crickets right? I mean, it says, does price transparency in your mind have any legs, or does it just seem silly?
So good question. It's on the front burners in a number of venues. I would say that it makes some sense, but again, if I take this from a Wall Street perspective, Wall Street looks at risk reward, and they don't like risk. They want the reward, but they just have an uncertainty is one of their biggest risks. So the more Washington starts talking about it, the more it starts to look like there will be a disruptive type of intervention on price transparency, then I would suggest that added uncertainty, added risk of what happens when you do something that disruptive will have a negative impact on the valuations of the healthcare stocks, whether it's pharmaceuticals or devices or people in between, from that standpoint. On the other hand, as we've seen, and as some of the times you've taught me this, is big change like that is hard to do. We're finding little changes are hard to do, but big changes are very hard to do. You're going to get a lot of opposition. Obviously, we've seen in the past how the pharmaceutical industry can organize. But little changes that get us there, take one step out of 20 steps now so that we can take the second and the third step. I can see that because we do need this. You can't continue at 16, 17, 18% of the economy going to healthcare and having the ultimate consumer, the end user, not know what the price comparisons are.
Yeah. No, I think the incremental step piece is pretty good insight. I mean, and we'll see how it bears out. This, for me, it's like the fourth or fifth time I've heard price transparency as being an elixir. I mean, it was talked about a lot actually in the Bush II administration. Doing something that I got when I think it was a grant I even got, or a contract I had at that time just to even look at this. And a lot of it is like, what prices are we talking about? At least we're having a better conversation about what that seems to be about now. I think the longest Time magazine article in history 4 or 5 years ago was written by Stephen Brill, basically remarking about the differences in charge prices as opposed to paid prices by insurance companies. Now, as an insurance policy nerd data geek like me, it's like, my response wasn't, I respect Stephen Brill. It's sort of like, it's kind of like, duh, like we knew that, but I guess it was a surprise to others, hence the notion of surprise billing and all that. But to your point about the push and pull, like right now, the hospitals are supposed to release their prices. There's a recent report that came out from the Healthcare Cost Institute, more or less looking at all the major health systems across the US, kind of grading them on how much they put out in terms of their price transparency. And some stuff is reported in the Wall Street Journal too. So Sutter Health in California has some stuff that's there, and comparing a few things like, a few delivery procedures and things like that. Our friends down south, and I don't know who's watching from down south in the Mayo Clinic, but have basically zero. So, and I think the interesting thing is that economics matters here too. The fine, if you don't comply, is relatively modest. I think many institutions sort of did the cost benefit and said, like, prices are not something we have to reveal. But round two is coming. That's when the insurers have to reveal all the prices, and
Well, and they're getting pressure from
that hasn't pushed back yet. So
they're getting pressure from their customers too. I remember a meeting a couple of years ago at Blue Cross Blue Shield, Minnesota, and they were telling us investors that not only just the price transparency for the insurer, but for the individual that has to pay 20%. Wait a second, you mean you have a list of who's the most expensive and who's the least expensive and where you see the quality trade-off there? Share that list with us, because we're paying 20% and we'd kind of like to know what that is. And so there's lots of things that are swirling right now that it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Will it change? Of course it'll change, but it will still be interesting to see how it plays out over probably a few years.
here's a medical device question for you, because I've taken you afield a little bit. So people are concerned, it seems, about how information technology and wearables are going to change the medical device space. Do you see all the Internet of Things invasion into medical devices as a disruption, or just an evolution of something that was going to happen along the way anyway?
I don't know that it's a disruption. It's part of the reason I went to the Consumer Electronics Show, right? I mean, you want to see what's going on there. And there's a couple of things that work. Well, where do I start? First off, talking to a pretty important person whose opinions can sway others in his industry, and the industry being venture capital. I asked him what he thought about basically your question, and he said, I don't know, I'm not investing in it. And I said, you're in the middle of Silicon Valley doing healthcare. There's wearables and sensors all around you. He goes, the medical devices that I've brought to market or helped bring to market had patents on them such that once I crossed all the barriers that they put in front of me, I could have 80% margins. I don't see those patents on the wearables. And it's only one example. This isn't a full survey, but the one example was first year I saw Fitbit at CES. Second year, there were 100 clones of Fitbit.
Right.
And Fitbit still seems to be doing well, but you have to work a lot harder to get to be profitable on significantly lower margins. So if that does happen, and we do get into digital health, which we will, I don't think it's going to be from the traditional healthcare venture capitalists funding it. It'll be probably from the tech side, and they'll make some mistakes along the way because they don't understand med tech the way the med tech guys do, but they'll just throw more money at it and work it that way. That's the consumer side. From the device or industry side, putting sensors, if you put a sensor on a AAA, artificial AAA, blanking on the word, but replacement, and you have a sensor for stresses and leaks that can reduce the amount of after surgery or problems that you're going to have, that's going to be a big deal. So you talk about IoT, and I saw another acronym today, IOMT, for medical things. There's going to be, it won't just be a worry that guy's shooting a chip into you. They really will shoot chips into you.
Yeah.
I followed a company very closely, private company, that actually had a chip on a pill. It was called Proteus. And their technology was fascinating. You took any pill you wanted, it had the chip on it, You had to work with the company to get the chip put on it. It was just a tiny little speck. One of the problems they had when they did some real clinical testing is the people would get these pills and they'd just scrape off that little piece of dust. Well, that was the chip. You swallowed it and you could, it would activate and it would talk to a patch on your chest and send that information to your phone and then on to your doctors. Absolutely fascinating technology. $500 million was put into this company over the years. It had a $1.5 billion market cap at valuation at one point, and went bankrupt last June. And the market was there, the interest in investors was there, the clever thinking was there, the patents were there. Execution got befuddled, and they didn't go out of business, but they got bought by, I'm blanking, a large pharmaceutical company for $15 million.
I see. But you know what that really tells you, Tom, is that leadership matters, and that's why we're creating the GMIMBA program, so that
there you go.
GMIMBA, CEO and CTO there, maybe it might have had a different outcome. They would have seen a whole different perspective. So first, Jessica is putting a message out to everyone. We're going to actually leave this webinar, and there's something in the chat that everyone should take a look at. We're going to be, since those of you who've stayed till the end, if you want to connect with us, I'm already in my bar. We're going to, Tom's raised his hand. We're gonna be going over. We're gonna be heading out to Off the Record, and for those of you in the DC, when we've done our DC field trip, we even have the coasters still, the Off the Record brand there at the DC bar at the Hayes Adams Hotel, right across from the White House. Hence why it was Off the Record. But Tom, yes, sorry.
Just one thing, because I've made this mistake before, and that is you don't want to leave and lose that chat from Jessica. So
right. So we will stay on, and we'll open a different place, or at least one of us will. And so we will see you in that other space. But thank you all for joining our first chat series, our fireside chat. We hope to do many more of these, just, and nothing else, just to stay engaged with you all and answer questions as they come along. It's a pretty exciting time. There's always things happening, regardless, both in policy and government and the globe. And, probably if we didn't have all this Zoom, we probably wouldn't have done all this. But at the same time, I think there's a way that we can build community even more in this space. And if you have a referral for anybody for our new program, please get them in. There's a June 1 and July 1 deadline. And it's probably one of the best value propositions we can think of based upon how the success of the students to date. So with that, we are close. I'm going to stop video, but we hope to see you all in our Zoom room. Take care, all. And we're out.